Good afternoon, my name is Riley Erickson, and throughout this year during AP Research, I have investigated how Christian values and beliefs influence anti-abortion arguments, specifically focusing on suburban Georgia. But first, why Georgia? Georgia in itself offers a unique religious environment to study abortion arguments. For example, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey in 2021 which analyzed the adults living within Georgia. This survey found that 80% of these adults identified as Christian, with a little bit under 50% of these individuals identifying specifically as evangelical Protestants. The significance here is that evangelical Protestants are the most commonly associated with stricter anti-abortion views. Furthermore, within the last 5 years, Georgia has passed the Heartbeat Bill or the Life Act bill. This effectively bans abortions and makes them illegal once the fetal heartbeat is detectable around the 5 to 6 week marks. The relevance that this issue poses on Georgia allows it to be the ideal setting to study the intersection between Christianity and anti-abortion sentiments. Public opinion is crucial because Georgia's abortion laws have been heavily shaped by constituents' values. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution found that the most prominently talked about issue within the 2022 election cycle was anti-abortion, demonstrating how deeply opinion influences policy, because during the media in this time, there was a lot of polarizing issues and it was an extremely hot topic. Furthermore, religious communities within the southeast region of the United States are often highly mobilized, often influencing political engagement. Understanding how these opinions form is essential for contextualizing Georgia's political landscape. The existing scholarly work has produced very remarkably consistent findings, most notably the 4 main variables, which I will touch on later during my conceptual framework. But for instance, Wilcox's work found that religion is the strongest predictor of anti-abortion attitudes across the entirety of the United States. Furthermore, Hoffman's research found that evangelical Protestants were the most commonly associated with anti-abortion views over the past 10 years within Georgia. Another researcher, Strickler, found that biblical literalism, which is how strict an individual interprets the Bible, increases the likelihood of opposition to abortion. Lastly, Amy Adamczak, one of my foundational authors, her work explored how religious salience, how central religion is to oneself, can influence opinions on controversial topics such as abortion. Collectively, all these variables show that religion does matter when forming abortion opinions. However, they speak in a broad context, specifically noting the national averages. They fail to isolate specific regions. Although these findings clearly highlight religion's strong predictive power, none of these research isolates Georgia, a state with a religious and social landscape different from national averages. These national averages are not able to be generalized to the Southeast region, mainly due to a higher rate of Christian affiliation within local communities, as well as higher rates of evangelical Protestants within the area. Furthermore, the culture of religion is more deeply embedded within local community. So even if people aren't necessarily religious, it is deeply embedded within their life as they've grown up within this community. Also, it is unknown whether a stronger presence of biblical literalism, church attendance, and religious salience will assert stronger opinions on anti-abortion due to the higher rates of Christianity within Georgia. But my project aims to directly address this gap by measuring the correlational patterns between these variables. This leads me to my research question, which is, to what extent does Christian values shape anti-abortion views among the public within Georgia, focusing specifically on suburban areas? My research reflects this gap by examining the extent, not just the presence of religion, and also considering other situational and contextual factors. So the conceptual framework for my entirety of my study directly mirrors the 4 main factors found within the literature review. These were the strongest predictive powers of how religious somebody is, which is something not necessarily numerically attainable. So you had to look at the strongest predictive powers of, measuring this. So the first is Christian denomination, which essentially just measures the group identity. Differing denominations have differing ideologies and also variations of beliefs. Furthermore, biblical literalism, which is, as mentioned earlier, how literal someone interprets the Bible, can indicate moral positioning on controversial issues such as abortion. The third main variable is church attendance frequency, which measures the behavioral religiosity of a group. And then finally is religious salience, which is just how central religion is to one's life. So for my method, I conducted a quantitative analysis measuring correlational levels via survey. My instrument was Microsoft Forms, and the first section of my survey was the ethical part. I had an informed consent form, which made sure that they were over the age of 18, living within Georgia, and I did this so that I would not have to get parental verification before asking the survey. If they did not complete this informed consent, then they would not be able to move on to the next section, which was the demographics. I asked their age, gender, race, and location to provide some background detail to the respondents. Then was the religious identity section, in which I asked what denomination of Christian they were. The third section, and the most important section of my survey, was the religious belief section, which I directly measured the three main variables: church attendance frequency, biblical literalism, and religious salience. And then the last section was the abortion attitude section, which I asked hypothetical and contextual questions such as if they were raped, if incest happened, or if there was a threat to the mother's life, to kind of gauge if their opinions would change. I measured all of these factors using the Likert scale, from 1 being the least to 5 being the most. And for my proposed hypothesis, I think that higher levels of Christianity will respond with higher correlations of anti-abortions within Georgia, specifically because of the higher rates of Christianity and stricter denomination presence within Georgia. So the overview of my results, it was collected over a 60-day period, slightly less than my peers because I did have some issues distributing my survey at the beginning, and I had changed my method quite a bit. My goal was to collect around 50, and I did only get 38 samples, but it was okay due to the smaller sample size correlating with a smaller area in Georgia, which I was measuring. So the results overview, I basically asked them and focused on the 3 primary variables and compared them and examined their relationship with anti-abortion opinions. So to properly analyze the relationship between the variables, I used Spearman's rank correlation coefficient, or as I refer to it in this presentation, Spearman's rho. The statistical test measured both the strength and direction of the relationship between 2 variables and based their rank values. Spearman's rho was the most appropriate method for the study because my data was measured using a Likert scale, as mentioned earlier, from 1 being the least to 5 being the most. And additionally, this test is non-parametric, which means it doesn't assume a normal distribution of data, which makes it so much more suitable for a smaller sample size, which is exactly what I needed to analyze my data. So overall, the quantitative results of my study indicated that, in general, higher levels of religious commitment correlate with higher levels of opposition to abortion. To begin, I analyzed the relationship between respondents' age and their abortion views. The sample itself was skewed a bit towards older individuals, as about 70% of my respondents were over the age of 55. So that's something to keep in mind when interpreting these results. But age showed a low moderate correlation with a Spearman's rho value of 0.32. Additionally, I examined the relation between gender and anti-abortion, and similarly, I found a low to moderate correlation, which is Spearman's rho value of 0.283. One of the more significant findings was the Spearman's rho value of 0.514, which measured the correlation between anti-abortion and religious salience. So the analysis indicated that a moderate positive correlation, suggesting that as individuals place greater importance on their own religious identity and incorporation into religion in their daily lives, their opposition to abortion tends to increase, as you can see from the graph. In addition to religious salience, biblical literalism also showed a moderate and strong positive correlation with anti-abortion attitudes. As shown in the graph above, there's a clear upwards trend indicating that as stronger interpretations of the Bible increase, as does anti-abortion views. These findings highlights that the importance of how religious beliefs are held within the Bible and not just how they are held. A similar pattern is observed within church attendance frequency, which was my most significant finding within my study. Participants who attended religious services tend to report much higher levels of anti-abortion sentiments, and this suggests that both personal belief and active participation within religious communities correlate significantly towards shaping anti-abortion values. and the Spearman's row correlation coefficient value was 0.6782, which is a pretty significant correlational level. So then I incorporated at the end of my survey a qualitative question to add depth and more personal experiences to my research, so I can kind of build off of the quantitative data that I previously collected. And I had asked them, in your own words, please describe how, if at all, your religious beliefs, denomination, or church community have shaped your views on abortion laws. So this is what one of the respondents had said verbatim. They said, my religious beliefs influence my views, but my personal experiences ultimately shape how I interpreted those beliefs. So participants all throughout the free response question frequently framed their views in terms of personal, moral, and ethical reasoning rather than just religion. And this suggests that while religion provides a framework, personal interpretation and contextual evidence ultimately shapes how these beliefs are applied to different situations. So this highlights that attitudes towards abortion are not solely dictated by religion, but instead emerge from an interaction between religious belief and personal experiences, which is a differing result compared to a lot of the previous scholarly work that I had read, which just really relied on religion, not really regarding other contextual and situational factors. So despite these findings, several limitations must be acknowledged. First, the sample size of 38. This limits the generalizability of my data. However, it's still okay because it's applied to a smaller geographical area rather than an entirety of a state, for example. The second is the issue of polarization within the media about abortion. So with abortion in the media, it's a very polarizing issue, and a lot of individuals may not have responded not correctly, but they probably did some more socially desirable answers, creating a self-reporter bias, and this could have influenced my results. These findings do have important implications, particularly in the context of political behavior and communication. Because religiosity is strongly associated with abortion attitudes, political messaging may intentionally appeal to religious values in order to influence voters' perspectives. More broadly, this demonstrates how deeply embedded moral and religious frameworks are within political decision-making. So to further the results found within my research, future research should focus on expanding the sample size and including a more diverse population to improve reliability, add depth to the data, and also increase representativeness within the sample. Additionally, extending the study past North Georgia and possibly doing a comparative analysis with another geographical region would help determine whether the patterns observed within this study are consistent across broader religious contexts. In conclusion, the findings of this study demonstrate that Christian beliefs do play a major and significant role in shaping anti-abortion views, most significantly through increased factors of church attendance frequency, biblical literalism, and religious salience. However, this influence is not isolated. Instead, the qualitative data rather suggest that attitudes towards abortion emerge through a complex interaction between religious beliefs, personal experience, and also social interaction and environment. So while religion often provides the foundational framework for moral reasoning, individuals actively interpret and apply these beliefs differently based on their own experiences and perspectives. Thank you, and here are my sources.
Okay. How did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead to your final research question?
So the initial exploration of my research, I had found specifically one of Amy Adamczak's work. It was the comparative analysis of the micro and macro. I'm not necessarily sure the exact title, but she did sort of a comparative analysis across differing countries to see how differing religions can play into their abortion views. So that kind of led me to think about, in a more local context, how different areas in Georgia where Christianity is higher would impact abortion views and also policy making.
Okay.
How did your new understanding address a gap in the scholarly conversation?
So my new understanding addresses a gap because while previous research had mentioned how integral Christianity was to shaping anti-abortion opinions, they failed to acknowledge a lot of other contextual and situational factors. And my research more so, it went into depth about the personal experiences and the life experience that actually shapes and kind of forms these opinions, rather than just saying the overview is just solely on religion or Christianity. It's actually a much more complex issue than that, and a lot of scholarly work fails to kind of recognize that.
What was the most important research skill you developed as a result of this process, and how might you apply it to your future endeavors?
So I would say analyzing texts and kind of figuring out what data is the most important was the probably best skill that I learned from this. Just having the survey and all the answers, it means something, but you have to understand what you're actually looking for and how to interpret the data and form that into an actual conclusion. So I think that will really help me in future endeavors. And furthermore, just skills like analyzing texts and public speaking even will help me with my future endeavors.
Okay.